He thought he heard a wounded animal, but what he found, curled in a nest of pine needles, was a girl with wolves at her side and snow in her hair. She never spoke a word. And yet, when the time came, she did what no one else dared. This is a story of silence, debt, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask questions, it answers with action. Stay until the end, because what she does isn't what you think. Chapter 1. The Howl and the Silence. The wind was sharp enough to carve through bone that night, slicing through his coat and the thin hope of warmth he had left. Snow fell without grace, drifting in crooked spirals from a moon so full it seemed swollen with secrets. The plains had long gone quiet. No birds, no hoofbeats, no sound but his own weary steps and the stiff creak of leather where rifle met shoulder. He wasn't hunting, not anymore. Just walking to stay warm, to pretend he had a destination. He would have kept going if not for the sound, a howl that didn't know if it wanted to be wolf or woman, low and fractured, rising and failing in the same breath. It pulled at something in his spine, and before he knew it, he was moving toward it, boots crunching over frost-bitten pine needles and brittle ice. The forest didn't welcome him. It watched. Branches clawed at his coat. He pushed through them, fingers numb but sure, breath coming in short, foggy bursts. Another howl, softer now, not a cry for help, not quite. More like something remembering what it was to hurt, then silence again, until he found her. A shape, first a lump in the snow under a fallen pine, cloaked in the thick dark of a worn shawl. The snow hadn't settled on her. It had given her space. Around her, 3 wolves lay in a circle, their bodies still but alert, like guards in a sacred place. One raised its head as he stepped closer. Yellow eyes caught moonlight, locked onto his, and for a long heartbeat neither moved. The wolf blinked first, then rested its head back on its paws. Permission, or a warning. He stepped into the clearing slowly, careful not to make a sound. The girl was curled like a question, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms around her legs. Her hair was matted, face smudged with soot and snow, barely more than a child. But she wasn't trembling, wasn't afraid, as if the cold knew not to touch her, as if the wolves hadn't been her captors, but her companions. He crouched nearby, not daring to touch her, only studying the soft rise and fall of her breath. Then her eyes opened, blue. Not sky blue or ocean blue, but ice-reflected flame, the kind of blue that comes from burning something too long. She looked at him like she'd already seen him before, and would again. He whispered, "You okay?" Knowing it was a foolish question, she didn't answer, didn't move, but her gaze held steady, unwavering. There was no plea there, no panic, just the quiet recognition that he had come, and that was enough. For now, behind her, one of the wolves yawned, stretched its massive frame, and settled back down. They weren't worried. She wasn't worried. And somehow, he wasn't either. Took off his coat, slowly, like one might lay down an offering, and held it out. Still, she didn't move. But when he set it near her and backed away, she reached for it, wrapped it around herself, pulled it close like memory. Only then did he realize this girl didn't need saving. She had survived something already. And, whatever that was, it had made her belong to this forest. These wolves, this silence. He stayed until morning, seated nearby with the rifle laid across his lap, eyes half closed. He didn't dare sleep, but he didn't leave either. When the sun touched the tops of the trees and spilled gold across the snow, she stood up without a word, coat draped over her shoulders, and walked toward him. And for the first time, he felt like he was the one being rescued. Chapter 2. The Girl Beneath the Pines. He wrapped her in the only blanket he had, thick wool that still carried the smoke of last winter, and she let him, wordless and still, letting her arms be guided more like ritual than comfort. The wolves didn't follow, but they watched, eyes glowing between the trees, silent as if some unspoken agreement had been made. The path was narrow and frozen, roots twisting up like ribs from the earth, but she didn't stumble. Her feet, bare and blistered, moved over the ice as if she belonged to it. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was practiced, and he walked just a step ahead, not leading, only offering a direction. When the cabin came into view, half buried in snow, chimney thinly smoking like a sigh, she paused, not from exhaustion, from recognition. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, hand resting on the old doorframe, her breath visible in the cold air, like she was remembering something long buried beneath bark and frost. He opened the door with a groan of rusted hinges and stepped aside. Inside, the cabin was small, one room, one bed, a stove, and a table that leaned slightly to the right. He built the fire higher, stacking kindling with urgency, the way one does when the silence of a room grows too thick. She entered slowly, eyes scanning the walls, the old boots by the door, the cracked window where snow crept in. She didn't speak, didn't ask, just sat, cross-legged by the far wall, not quite looking at him, not quite looking away. He boiled snow in a dented tin kettle, the kind that lost its shine a decade ago. The room filled with steam and the scent of pine smoke. He offered her a cup, and she took it without hesitation, fingers wrapping around the metal like it was something sacred. She drank, ate the dry bread. He sat down, all without thanks, without words. Her movements were deliberate, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes noise feel like sin. That night, she curled up in the corner, back to the fire, one arm under her head, the blanket around her like a shield. He watched her as the flames danced, shadows across her face, soft, dirt-smudged, lined with something too old for her years. He wanted to ask her name. It itched at the edge of his tongue, but something in the way she breathed, slow and sure, told him, let her keep it. For now. Outside, the wolves had gone, but their presence lingered, in her silence, in her stillness, in the feeling that whatever had happened before tonight hadn't ended. It had only paused, and he didn't know it yet. But from that moment on, he'd never again feel alone, not even in silence. Chapter 3. The Pact Without Words. The snow came and went in waves, brushing against the cabin like a breath held too long, and finally exhaled. The days blurred, not with boredom, but with the kind of rhythm born only in survival. She still hadn't spoken a word, not even in sleep, but the way she moved began to fill the silence with something different: intent, care, presence. At first, she only watched him stack wood and stir the fire, her eyes following but never asking. Then one morning, without announcement, she rose with the dawn, took the axe, and stepped outside. He watched her from the window, small, thin, wrapped in his old coat, but the way she held that axe made her seem 10 feet tall. The blade was nearly the length of her arm, but she swung it like she'd known it forever. The wood split clean, again and again. No wasted movement. By noon, she'd stacked enough to last a week. She came back inside, brushed snow from her shoulders, and without a glance or gesture, picked up a torn sleeve of his coat and began to stitch. Her fingers were steady, and though the thread was thick and clumsy, the needle moved with the grace of memory. She fixed the roof, next patching the leaks with pine bark and sealing it with resin boiled down over the fire. When he tried to help, she didn't stop him, but she didn't need him either. They worked in tandem, like two gears falling into place after a long, grinding stall. No orders, no roles, just motion shared between them. One evening, he came back from the trap line with a rabbit swinging from his belt, expecting the cabin to be dark and quiet. But the door was latched. He hesitated, then knocked softly, not out of habit, but out of respect. No answer. When he pushed the door open, the heat hit him first, then the scent of pine and blood. She was crouched by the table, a rag in her hand, scrubbing with quiet focus. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair tied back with a strip of linen. There was something almost ceremonial in the way she moved, as if this task was sacred, not cleaning, erasing. He set the rabbit down gently and said nothing. She didn't look up, didn't speak. She finished her task, rinsed her hands, and took the rabbit to the hearth. As she skinned and cleaned it, he poured water into a battered tin cup and slid it toward her. She nodded once. That was all. They sat side by side on the floor that night, plates in their laps, eating in silence. The fire crackled behind them, and outside the wind howled through the pines like something alive and ancient. He passed her the last piece of bread. She tore it in half and gave it back. It was the closest thing to a conversation they'd had. That night, smoke curled wrong from the chimney, and he woke coughing, lungs tight. She was already up, seated at the window with her knees to her chest, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her that first night. Her face was turned to the trees, pale, in the moonlight, eyes unfocused and wide as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Something old, something wild. By morning, he realized the silence between them had changed. It no longer stretched like an emptiness. It held shape, like stone laid carefully into a wall. They didn't need words. The crack of kindling, the scrape of metal, the faint hum she sometimes made while boiling water. It was all their language now, a quiet one, but not empty, and somewhere between the stitching and the bread, the smoke and the moonlight, they had become something more than strangers, not quite kin, not yet friends, but bound by something deeper than understanding, the will to remain when leaving was easier, the choice to stay, without oath or question. They had formed a pact, one born not of desperation, but of respect, and perhaps, in a world that had long forgotten kindness, that was the rarest vow of all. Chapter 4. The River That Didn't Freeze. They found the river in thaw, long before spring dared show her face, a strange thing, that current wide and dark and unyielding, cutting through the snow-blanketed forest like a scar across an old hunter's chest. He had never seen moving water in that season, not here, not with the ground still locked in frost and the trees still groaning under the weight of 1,000 icy nights. Yet there it was, loud and restless, defying the silence that ruled the valley. She was the one who noticed it first. They had been walking for hours through the white hush when she stopped. Her boots crunched once, then stilled. She tilted her head like a deer catching a far-off sound. Then she moved, not with urgency, but with certainty, like a compass needle drawn to something older than maps. He followed her through thickets and down slopes, glazed in brittle ice, until they broke through to a clearing. And there it was, the river that shouldn't have been. It ran black and silver, smoke over stone, churning with impossible warmth. She didn't speak, just stepped toward it, slowly, reverently, and sank to her knees at the edge like she was returning to something she'd lost. Her fingers touched the surface, and the steam rose around her like breath from a sleeping giant. She stayed there for hours, unmoving, eyes lost in the current. He watched from a distance, unsure whether to join her or let her be, unsure whether she even remembered he was there. When night fell, they made camp beneath a pine heavy with snow. The river hissed beside them, never freezing, never still. He built the fire, she gathered wood. They didn't talk, they didn't need to. The sound of water and wind spoke louder than words. When he woke later that night to a strange silence, no fire crackle, no breath beside him, he reached for his rifle, and then he saw it. She was standing again at the river's edge, pale in moonlight, unmoving, watching something. A shape lumbered from the shadows, a bear, huge and ragged, come to drink. He froze. His hand went to the rifle, but she lifted her hand, not in fear, not to ward it off, just a slow, deliberate motion, as if to say, not tonight. The bear paused, looked at her, then, without noise, bent to drink, and vanished again into the trees. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, something had shifted. He looked at her not as a mystery to solve, but a force to respect. She wasn't lost, she wasn't broken, she wasn't something the forest had spared, she was something it had made. And in that cold dawn light, beside a river that refused to freeze, he finally understood. She was the forest, and he was the guest. Chapter 5. The blood on her hands. It was the kind of cold that settled in your bones and didn't let go. The fire had burned low sometime after midnight, and he dozed off in the old rocking chair, boots still on, rifle resting against the wall within reach. She was sitting by the hearth, half asleep, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the dying embers as if she could read some secret language in them. Outside, snow whispered against the window panes. The wind had stilled, that kind that only shows up right before something breaks, crept in like fog under the door. They came just before the light. 5 of them, maybe 6. He'd never know for sure. Hooves crunching snow, leather creaking, the low hush of men who thought they were ghosts, bandits, drifters, scavengers. They thought the cabin was empty, or maybe just occupied by one man too tired to fight. He was groggy when he heard the soft crunch of a boot outside, but she was already moving. No sound, just the soft shift of her body rising from the floor like smoke. She didn't speak, didn't look at him, only walked to the door and stood beside it barefoot, in that long wool coat she wore like armor. He was still shaking off sleep when the latch clicked. The door swung open. The first man stepped in. One boot past the threshold, half a sneer curling on his lips. He never got to finish whatever curse or demand he had prepared. She moved fast, not with rage, not wild or unhinged, but with a precision that felt almost holy. One clean motion, her knife, a thin, curved thing she'd carved herself, swept upward. There was a wet noise, and the man slumped forward. knees. First, he blinked, tried to rise, grabbed for the rifle. But the second man was already coming through, gun halfway drawn. He fired a single shot. The man dropped hard, head hitting the frame on the way down. But she didn't wait. She was already outside. They heard the muffled grunts, the scuffle of boots in snow, the crack of bone. He stumbled to the door, vision still blurred from sleep, and saw her in the half-light, shoulders, steady eyes empty. One man tried to run. She didn't chase him, but he didn't make it far either. When it was done, she stood alone among the dead. Her hands were red, and her breath came slow, and even she didn't tremble, didn't scream. She just turned, walked past him like nothing had happened, and went down to the creek that cut through the snow. He followed at a distance, boots crunching over the red-stained powder. She knelt by the ice-lined edge and scrubbed her hands, not urgently, methodically, like she was cleaning off paint. The blood spread into the snow melt, thin pink fingers reaching out until they vanished beneath the surface. She looked up once and saw him standing there. Her eyes were calm, not empty but not apologetic either. She didn't explain herself, didn't offer a word. He didn't ask. Back in the cabin, she sat again by the fire, fed it a log, and leaned against the stone wall like it was just another morning. Steam rose from her damp hands, her shoulders slackened. Within minutes, she was asleep. But he couldn't sleep, not that night, not with the smell of blood still clinging to the air and the snow outside already beginning to bury the bodies. He sat in that same rocking chair, rifled across his knees, watching the flames dance in her reflection. He wondered what else she had done, what she had run from, what it had taken to turn her into that quiet storm of a woman who didn't hesitate. But more than anything, he wondered how she slept so easily, because for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel safer being the one with the gun. Chapter 6. The Winter Cabin. After the blood, the snow fell heavier, not in fury, but in silence, thicker each morning, quieter each dusk. The world outside the cabin sank into white, and with it, so did the questions he'd once carried. He didn't ask her where she learned to move like that, or how her hands could do such things without trembling. He didn't ask what drove her to violence without hesitation. Whatever answers she had, they weren't meant for words, and he no longer felt entitled to them. So they slipped into a rhythm, one not spoken, only lived. He hunted, she trapped. He'd wake before the sun and step into the blue morning chill, rifle slung over his shoulder, the forest still holding its breath. Some days he came back with deer, other days only frostbite and the faint smell of wolf. She never scolded him, just looked once into the burlap sack, nodded, and returned to her own quiet work. She was precise in her movements, in her silences, in the way she laid snares by the creek with twine and thin branches. The animals feared her more than the winter itself. They cooked side by side, rarely speaking. The fire cracked. The wind howled outside, sometimes shrieking like a banshee through the gaps in the logs. But the cabin held. Because she held it, something changed, though he couldn't name it. Small things, subtle like falling snow. That one evening, while the stew boiled low, she placed a single dried flower on the mantel. It was brown, delicate, its edges curled from time but somehow still intact. She didn't explain where she'd found it, just stood for a moment, arranging it like a sacred object, then sat back down. Another night, she returned with her boots soaked and her eyes bright. In her hands, smooth stones from the riverbed, polished by water and time, in shades of red, green, blue. She lined them up along the windowsill, like a child showing off treasure. He watched, and she let him. She didn't smile, but her silence had softened. There were no walls to what she was building, no nails, no frame, but he felt it grow around them anyway. The way she folded the blankets, the way she swept the floor with pine branches every third day, like a ritual, the way she whispered to the fire before sleep. It was something older than habit, older than names, a kind of order that wrapped the cabin like smoke wraps old wood. He realized, slowly, that she wasn't just surviving here. She was claiming the space not as a fort, or a hideout, or a battlefield, but as something whole, something sacred. And she let him stay. That was the miracle of it. Not the warmth in winter, not the food on the table, but the way she accepted his presence without needing him. The way she allowed him into a world she never spoke of, one where blood had been spilled and stillness had returned. He didn't speak of gratitude, but it sat in him, heavy as snow on the roof. One night, as the wind howled and the firelight flickered low, he watched her fall asleep in the chair across from him. The dried flowers still rested on the mantel, the stones still glimmered faintly by the window. And he understood this was no longer just a cabin in the woods. It was hers, and by some grace he couldn't explain, it had made room for him too. Chapter 7. The Men Who Came for Her. It was the kind of morning where the air bit at your throat and the snow squeaked underfoot sharp and dry. He was splitting wood behind the cabin, the axe thunking into frozen rounds, when the sound of hooves broke the hush. 3 riders, broad-shouldered, dust-covered despite the snow. They came up the path like they owned the land, leather creaking, laughter loud, boots to clean for real trail men. He saw them before she did, or maybe she saw them first and just didn't show it. That was her way. They didn't speak right away, just sat there atop their horses, staring. One chewed something. Another smirked like he knew the ending of a story no one had told yet. The third, older with a gray mustache and dead eyes, held up a silver ring between 2 fingers, said a name neither of them repeated. "She belongs to someone," he said, voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. She stood at the doorway, calm as dawn. Her coat was buttoned, hair tied back, no weapon visible, but she never needed one to make men hesitate. Her eyes didn't flicker. She didn't look to him for help, didn't step back, just stood there, as if the land itself had chosen her and had no interest in returning her to anyone. He came around the cabin then, rifle not raised but visible, not threatening, just there, a fact, like the cold, like the fire they'd keep burning that night. The 3 men didn't dismount, didn't smile either, not anymore. "She's not a thing," he said, voice even low. "And this isn't a place you give orders." They didn't get the chance to respond. The first man, a wiry one with a scar down his cheek, leaned forward like he was going to spit. Before he could open his mouth, she moved, fast, not wild, precise, like always. She stepped forward, grabbed the bridle of his horse, yanked it hard, and drove her knee into the animal's side. The horse bucked. The man tumbled backward off the saddle and landed face first in the snow with a sickening crunch. When he looked up, his nose was sideways, blood poured down into his mustache. He whimpered something. She didn't flinch. The second man reached for something, maybe a gun, maybe a thought, but by then, an arrow buried itself in the leather of his saddle, inches from his thigh. He jolted, pale, and looked around like death had tapped him on the shoulder. But it was only her, lowering the small bow she kept hidden behind the doorway. She hadn't missed, she'd warned. The third man, the gray one, said nothing. He just watched her, stared long and cold. Then he turned his horse without a word and rode back the way they came. The other 2 followed, one bleeding, the other shaking. She stood there long after they disappeared into the trees. He said nothing, not because he didn't care, but because he understood now. Some pasts are made of sharp glass and locked doors. Some names aren't meant to be repeated. Some women aren't rescued. They rescue themselves. When she turned to go back inside, her face was unreadable. The fire was still burning, the stew still warm. She sat, poured herself a bowl, and said nothing about what had just happened. He didn't ask. She never said who they were, and he never needed to know. All he knew was this: she stayed, and so did he. Chapter 8. The Ride Through the Storm. They left before winter gave its final howl, when the snow still came sideways and the sky remained a sullen gray, but the air smelled faintly of thaw. No words had been exchanged, no great decision declared. Just one morning, she packed what little they had into 2 old saddlebags, dried meat, a flint, her knife, his rifle, and a blanket worn thin at the edges. He didn't ask where they were going. He only nodded, saddled the horse, and followed her lead. The cabin, still warm from the night's fire, vanished behind them into the trees. It had become homeland now, like all things she touched. It was something she could walk away from without regret. The forest watched them go, and the wolves returned not as threats this time, but as silent shadows flanking their path. He didn't know if they were the same ones, but they moved with strange purpose, weaving through trees, keeping pace. He wondered if she saw them too, or if they were only there for him to notice. The sky darkened before noon. What started as flurries thickened into sheets of white. The wind picked up, cutting through coats, sneaking under scarves, finding skin like it was searching for weakness. They pressed on, up the ridge, hooves slipping on ice, her leading the way with head low and shoulders forward like a figure carved from wind and stone. He slipped once bad. His boot caught a root under the snow and he went down hard, ribs landing against the frozen earth. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. Pain bloomed sharp. The world tilted. She was beside him in seconds. No panic, no questions. She took his rifle without a word, slung it across her back, and wrapped his arm over her shoulder. He felt useless, like weight, but she moved with quiet strength, guiding him forward one step at a time. By the time they crested the ridge, the storm had become a living thing roaring in their ears, clawing at their faces, filling every breath with ice. And still, she moved forward. They found the cave just before dark, tucked behind a rock fall, like a secret. She got him inside, lowered him gently, and vanished again into the blizzard. He drifted in and out, barely aware of the fire she built from dead wood and broken branches. At some point, her hands pressed against his chest, a cloth on his forehead, warm broth between cracked lips. Fever came fast. Dreams came faster. His mind wavered between past and present, between the warmth of the cabin and the heat burning behind his eyes. But her voice, soft and steady, pulled him back each time. She whispered things he couldn't remember. Or maybe they were never words at all. When he finally woke, the storm had passed. The wind outside had softened to a hush, like snow brushing pine needles. The fire had burned low, casting a dim orange glow across the stone walls. And she was there, curled beside him, head on his chest, breath rising and falling with his own. Her arm lay across him protectively, not like someone afraid of losing him, but like someone who had chosen to stay. He didn't move, didn't speak, just lay there, listening to the sound of her breathing and the faint crackle of the dying fire. She had carried him, saved him, watched over him through the dark, and, once again, like every time before, she had not asked for thanks. Chapter 9. The bullet meant for him. Spring came slow that year, dragging its feet through the mud and melting snow. Buds began to swell on the branches, creeks murmured under sheets of slush, and the sun stretched its fingers a little longer. Each day, he started to believe maybe the worst had passed. Maybe life, quiet and unremarkable, was finally beginning again. They'd reached a trading post near the edge of a dusty crossroad town. Just supplies, a few new cartridges, maybe news of what lay ahead. He tied the horse outside. She walked beside him, wrapped in her coat despite the warming air, eyes always watching. Trouble wore a familiar face that day: leather gloves, a crooked jaw, a star-shaped scar under one eye, a bounty hunter, old and reckless, misinformed, a poster tucked into his saddlebag, weathered and wrong. The name wasn't his, but the face could have passed. The man hadn't cared for details. There was no warning, no raised voice, no glare. Across the saloon, just the soft hiss of tension snapping and the crack of a revolver. He never saw the shooter, never even turned, but she did. She moved faster than breath, faster than thought, like she'd always known it would happen, like the bullet had been following them since the beginning, and she had only been waiting for the right second to meet it. He heard the sound first, a dull, awful thud, then her body hitting the ground. She didn't cry out. The shot tore through her shoulder, spun her halfway before she crumpled to the dirt. Her coat bloomed dark around the wound. He dropped to his knees, hands already slick with blood before his mind caught up to the moment. People scattered. The shooter was gone, maybe dead, maybe running. It didn't matter. She was the only thing he saw. Her eyes were open, clouded with pain, yes, but still clear, still anchored. He pressed his hand against the wound, cursed the blood that kept coming, and told her over and over that she couldn't leave. Not like this, not now. And she didn't scream, not once. She only whispered, through chattering teeth and shallow breath, "You found me. I won't leave you alone." He carried her 4 miles, through thorn-thick woods, over uneven paths, across a shallow stream that bit at his knees. His arms ached, his legs burned. Her blood soaked into his shirt, warm and terrifying. She was weight and heat and silence. He talked the whole way, told her stories, promised he'd fix this, promised he'd learn how, promised he'd take her back to the cabin or build her another one, promised he'd never let the world come that close to her again. She only breathed when they reached a clearing by the edge of the old forest. He laid her down, built a fire with trembling hands, and cleaned the wound with melted snow. She never flinched, just watched him through half-closed eyes, as if seeing something he couldn't. All night, he sat awake beside her, his fingers wrapped around hers, waiting to hear the quiet change in her breathing that would tell him she was slipping away. But morning came, and with it, a pink hue over the sky. She was still there, still breathing, and for the first time since he met her, she looked fragile not in strength, but in how much she trusted him. That wound, that moment, Tit became a vow. The bullet had been meant for him, but she had stepped into its path without hesitation, and now he carried more than her pain. He carried the truth. He hadn't just found her, she had chosen to be found. Chapter 10. The Woman Who Stayed. Years passed the way snow melts in the mountains, slowly at first, then, all at once, seasons folded into each other like pages of a story half remembered. Springs came greener, summers hotter, winters still bit, but the wind no longer howled like it used to. Time softened the world and him. His beard had gone gray, more salt than pepper now. His step had grown slower, his hands stiffer. The rifle hung above the fireplace untouched. Most days, he didn't need it. He spent his mornings on the porch, carved from pine and patched 100 times over, sipping black coffee from a tin mug with more dents than shine. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a home, not just for them, but for others. Children now ran through the trees beyond the clearing, their laughter echoing where silence once ruled. Faces came and went, neighbors, travelers, kin. Some stayed a night, others never left. And she remained the one constant thought. She moved through the house like weather, quiet, familiar, essential, still wrapped in her long coat, though now more thread than cloth, still braiding her hair in the morning light, still humming low, tuneless melodies that stirred something primal in the wolves that lingered at the tree line in winter, watching, like old friends too wild to come closer. She mended clothes near the window, needles flashing in rhythm, eyes softened by years. She still never said much, but her presence was a language of its own, stirring soup at just the right hour, placing another log on the fire before the cold could settle in, humming lullabies she never claimed as hers. Sometimes the children would ask, "Who is she?" He would smile, lines deep around his eyes, and answer the same way every time. She never said, but she stayed. When everyone else left, she stayed. They didn't need more than that. No one ever did. He never asked again about her past. Not after that winter. Not after the bullet. Not after the storm. Some things don't need unraveling. Some stories only grow stronger when they're left to settle deep, like roots beneath snow. And when the time came, when the wind stilled and his lungs grew shallow, he was right where he wanted to be. The children were grown, the cabin full of soft light, and the forest stood watch outside. She sat beside him, her hand wrapped in his, weathered fingers still warm, the same hand he had once found resting in the snow, her breath faint, her body circled by wolves like a fallen queen under oath. No tears, no panic, just the stillness of two souls that had long since merged. And as his eyes dimmed, he didn't fear the dark, because he wasn't alone. She was still there. She had always been there. The woman who never gave a name, never asked for a future but built one anyway. Not with promises, but with presence.